My husband laughed when his friends asked what I did for a living. She's still figuring it out, Daniel said, swirling his drink. 8 years and no real job. They all laughed. Loud, comfortable, confident. I smiled and kept my voice steady. I've had years of practice pretending their words don't sting. They didn't know the house they were sitting in was purchased with my dividends. They didn't know the bonuses they bragged about came from a company I built from scratch. They didn't know the CEO of Northbridge Dynamics, the firm they proudly worked for, was standing right in front of them. Me, Emma Carter, founder, majority shareholder, silent observer. I let my husband believe I was unemployed. I let him underestimate me. I let him talk. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one notices. And by Monday morning, I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. By Monday morning, I was going to fire them all. My name is Emma Carter, and for 8 years I've been married to a man who believes I depend on him. Daniel Carter, Vice President of Operations at Northbridge Dynamics, loves introducing himself with his full title. He stands taller when he says it. He speaks slower, as if the words themselves are expensive. What he never realized is that I chose that title for him. I founded Northbridge 12 years ago in a cramped apartment with secondhand furniture and a laptop that overheated every hour. I built it contract by contract, rejection by rejection. I signed every early client myself. I negotiated every investor deal. I slept on office couches and celebrated milestones alone. By the time I met Daniel at a charity gala in Chicago, Northbridge was already thriving. But I didn't tell him. I told him I was consulting. It wasn't technically a lie. After 2 failed relationships where men fell in love with my net worth instead of my character, I wanted something different. I wanted to know who would choose me if they believed I had nothing to offer. Daniel seemed kind back then. "You don't need to impress me," he told me on our 3rd date. "Ambition is great, but I care about heart." I believed him. When we got engaged, he insisted on a prenuptial agreement. "My lawyer says it's smart," he explained carefully. "Just protection. You know how things are." I signed without hesitation. What he didn't know was that my attorney had quietly added clauses of my own standard asset protection language tied to executive misconduct and moral turpitude. Legal, clean, airtight. I never expected to need them. After we married, we moved into what Daniel proudly called our dream home. He loved giving tours. "Hard work pays off," he would say, gesturing around at the imported marble and custom wine cellar. I would smile and nod. He thought his bonuses covered it. They didn't. At first, the teasing about my career was light. "So, what's the big project this week?" he'd ask casually. But over time, it changed. "You ever think about something stable? Must be nice not having pressure. I don't know how you stay motivated without a real office." A real office. I have an entire executive floor with my name on the lease. He just never noticed. What hurt wasn't the jokes. It was the shift in respect. Somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped seeing me as his equal and started seeing me as someone lucky to be supported. And the more successful he became at Northbridge, the more confident he grew in that belief. What he didn't understand was this. I was watching, quietly, carefully, and the woman he thought I was? She was only ever a mask. The dinner started like every other performance. Daniel texted me at noon. "Having the guys over tonight. Keep it simple, okay?" Keep it simple. That meant no strong opinions, no business talk, no challenging him in front of his colleagues. By 7, the house smelled like rosemary chicken and aged bourbon. I wore a soft blue dress, elegant but understated, the version of me Daniel preferred. Mark Reynolds arrived first, loud and already half smiling like he owned whatever room he entered. Tyler Brooks followed, talking about quarterly projections before he even set down his coat. Kevin Mitchell came last, carrying a bottle of whiskey that Daniel would later brag about as if he'd purchased it himself. They settled into the living room, my living room, discussing Northbridge like it was their private kingdom. "Best quarter we've ever had," Mark said, raising his glass. "We're untouchable." Daniel leaned back, pride written all over his face. "That's what happens when leadership is strong." I nearly choked on my water. Leadership. I signed off on the expansion strategy 6 months ago. I approved the capital allocation for the division that doubled their profits. I personally negotiated the client contract they were celebrating, but I stayed quiet. Then Mark turned to me. "So, Emma, What's new in your world? His tone was playful, curious in the way people are when they already think they know the answer. Daniel didn't wait for me to respond. She's still exploring options, he said casually. Trying to find her thing. Tyler laughed. That must be nice, no deadlines. Daniel grinned. Yeah, zero stress. Meanwhile, we're over here carrying the company. Carrying. The word echoed in my chest. I actually enjoy having flexibility, I said evenly. Mark tilted his head. Flexibility is good, unless it turns into drifting. There it was. Polite condescension wrapped in a joke. Daniel poured another drink and smirked. She even tried applying at Northbridge once. Kevin's eyebrows shot up. No way. Oh yeah, Daniel continued. Didn't make it past round one. They burst into laughter. Something inside me went completely still. That application had been a controlled internal audit. A leadership behavior assessment I personally authorized after anonymous HR complaints surfaced. The irony was almost poetic. I withdrew. I corrected quietly. Daniel waved his hand dismissively. Same difference. No, it wasn't. Tyler leaned forward. Honestly, Emma, corporate life isn't for everyone. It's intense. Intense. I built Northbridge from nothing. I survived hostile negotiations, investor pressure, market crashes. I buried my father the same year I secured our first $1 million contract and still showed up to work the next morning. But sure, corporate life wasn't for me. Daniel glanced around at his friends, encouraged by their laughter. Can you imagine her running something like Northbridge? He said. She'd last a week. The room exploded. That was the moment. Not the jokes. Not the tone. Not even the arrogance. It was the certainty in his voice. The certainty that I was smaller than him, that I needed him, that I would always stay in my quiet little corner, grateful to be included. I set my glass down carefully. Excuse me, I said calmly. Daniel didn't even look up. Don't wait up, babe. We might get into strategy mode. Strategy mode. I walked upstairs without another word. Behind me, their laughter grew louder. But this time, it didn't sting. It clarified. And by the time I closed the bedroom door, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They hadn't just mocked me. They had just audited themselves. And they failed. The moment I shut the bedroom door, the laughter downstairs faded into a dull hum. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I walked straight to my study. To anyone else, it was a decorative library shelves of business books, framed art, a polished oak desk. But behind the third panel on the left was a biometric lock disguised as part of the trim. I pressed my thumb against it. The panel slid open. 3 monitors flickered to life. Northbridge Dynamics Global Dashboard. Executive Compliance Reports. Board Communications Channel. This was my real world. Not the blue dress downstairs. Not the soft smile. Not the still figuring it out version of Emma. A message from Sarah Bennett, my chief legal officer, flashed on the secure line. Board meeting confirmed. Monday, 9 a.m. Executive review file compiled. Legal prepared. I exhaled slowly. For the past 11 months, Sarah and I had been documenting internal concerns. Anonymous HR complaints about dismissive management behavior. Unapproved vendor relationships tied to personal friendships. Expense reports that pushed ethical boundaries. Subtle intimidation tactics in performance reviews. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, but enough to show a pattern. And patterns matter in leadership. Most of the issues trace back to Daniel's executive circle. Mark, Tyler, Kevin, and Daniel himself. I had tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was adjustment stress, growth pressure, ego. But leadership isn't about ego. It's about responsibility. I clicked into archived meeting transcripts. There he was. Daniel dismissing a female project lead's proposal without review. Mark joking about diversity hires. Tyler cutting off junior staff mid-presentation. Small moments, but repeated. Northbridge was built on a strict executive conduct clause, one I personally drafted years ago after watching another company implode from internal toxicity. The clause was clear. Demonstrated pattern of hostile leadership behavior constitutes grounds for immediate termination for cause. I stared at Daniel's name on the executive roster. Vice President of Operations. My husband. I took off my wedding ring and placed it on the desk beside the keyboard. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is reactive. This was clarity. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, my phone vibrating with an incoming secure call. I answered. "Everything's ready," Sarah said calmly. "Once you authorize, compliance triggers automatically." "I'll authorize Monday morning," I replied. She paused. "Are you certain?" I looked at the security camera feed from the living room downstairs. Daniel leaned back in his chair, animated, confident, his friends hanging on every word. "I've never been more certain." "Understood," Sarah said. "Once we move, there's no reversal." "I know." Another burst of laughter echoed faintly through the ceiling. Daniel's voice rose above the others. She wouldn't survive in corporate leadership. The irony was almost elegant. I closed the dashboard and leaned back in my chair. For 8 years, I had protected my marriage by minimizing myself. For 11 months, I had protected my company by observing quietly. But protection without accountability becomes permission. And I would not permit my own company to rot from the inside, not even for him. I opened a final document. Executive Review Protocol Level Red. Suspension Authority. CEO only. I hovered my cursor over the authorization line. Not yet. Timing matters. Leadership is about choosing the moment. And I wanted Daniel to see it coming. Not from home. Not from whispers. From the head of the table. I powered down the screens. Downstairs, chairs scraped across marble floors. The men were leaving. Car doors slammed outside. Silence returned to the house. I stood in the doorway of my study and looked at the hallway at the framed photos of vacations, anniversaries, smiling versions of us. I whispered into the quiet room. "You underestimated the wrong woman." Monday was 2 days away. And I was done being invisible. Monday morning arrived colder than usual. Chicago's skyline looked sharp and metallic against the early light, the kind of morning that feels like something is about to break. Daniel rushed around the kitchen, slightly hungover but energized. "Big strategy meeting today," he said, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the microwave. "Board might finally approve the expansion plan." "The expansion plan. My expansion plan. I hope it goes well," I replied evenly. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly. "Don't stress about your job stuff. Something will come along." I held his gaze for a moment. "Oh, something will," I said quietly. He didn't notice the shift in my tone. By the time Daniel left, I was already dressed. But not as Emma Carter. I wore a modest navy suit tailored but intentionally understated. Low heels, minimal makeup, hair down, no jewelry except small studs. I looked ordinary. At 6:30 a.m., I entered Northbridge Dynamics through the service entrance. The security guard glanced at my temporary badge. "Interview?" he asked. "Yes," I said softly. "Emily Clark." He nodded without recognition. I had spent years avoiding the office during peak hours, conducting most executive oversight remotely or through secure board channels. Very few employees knew what I looked like. That anonymity had once protected my personal life. Now it would reveal the truth. At 8:45 a.m., Daniel strode through the lobby, confident, relaxed, laughing at something on his phone. He walked right past me. Didn't even hesitate. For a second, I studied him the way I might study a new hire. Strong presence, charismatic, comfortable in power. But comfort without humility becomes carelessness. At 9 a.m., I was escorted into a glass conference room. Kevin and Mark sat across from me. Neither recognized me. Kevin skimmed my resume. "Been between roles for a while," he observed, not looking up. "Yes," I replied calmly. Mark leaned back in his chair. "Northbridge is high performance, fast pace, high expectations." "I understand." Kevin folded his hands. "What makes you think you're ready for that environment?" I held his gaze gently. "I've handled pressure before." He smirked slightly. "Corporate leadership isn't theory," he said. "It's survival. Survival. I built this company during a recession, but I let a small flicker of nervousness enter my voice. I'm willing to learn." Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then grinned. "Daniel." I didn't need to see the message to know what it said. Kevin's phone vibrated seconds later. He suppressed a laugh. The energy in the room shifted. Condescension became entertainment. "Well," Mark said finally, closing my resume, "we'll be in touch." Dismissed. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard Daniel's voice around the corner. Yeah, that was her. Still trying. Laughter followed. I didn't slow down. I walked into the executive restroom at the end of the corridor, locked the door, opened the garment bag waiting inside. Inside was my real armor. A charcoal Chanel suit. Structured, precise, powerful. Louboutin heels. My CEO access badge. I changed slowly, not because I was hesitating, because I wanted to feel the transition. When I stepped back into the hallway, the woman in the reflection of the mirrored wall was no longer Emily Clark. She was Emma Carter, founder, majority shareholder, chief executive officer. I walked toward the private elevator, the one installed years ago for executive access only. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw the badge. "Good morning, Miss Carter," she said quietly. "Good morning." The elevator doors closed. My reflection stared back at me in the polished steel, calm, steady, not furious, just finished pretending. At the top floor, Sarah was waiting. "Board is seated," she said softly. "Security is in position." "And Daniel?" I asked. "Executive meeting room B." Celebrating last quarter's performance. Of course he was. I adjusted my jacket. "Let's not interrupt the celebration just yet," I said. "I'll do that personally." As I walked down the executive hallway, heels echoing sharply against marble, I felt something unexpected. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Authority. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice. I stopped outside meeting room B. Through the glass, I could see Daniel at the head of the table, laughing, confident, certain. He thought he ran this building. I placed my hand on the door handle and opened it. The room fell silent the moment I stepped inside. Daniel's smile froze. Mark's chair stopped mid-turn. Tyler blinked twice, like his mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. "Emma?" Daniel said slowly. "What are you doing up here?" His tone wasn't angry yet, just confused. I closed the door gently behind me. "I believe this is where leadership meets on Mondays," I said calmly. "I thought I'd join." Kevin let out a short laugh. "This floor is restricted." "I know," I replied. I walked to the head of the table. My chair. The one Daniel had been sitting in during executive sessions for years, believing it symbolized his authority. I didn't rush. I didn't glare. I simply placed my leather portfolio on the table and sat down. Daniel stood abruptly. "Emma, this isn't appropriate." I met his eyes. "Actually, Daniel, it's long overdue." The air in the room shifted. Confusion turned to discomfort. I tapped my phone. Every screen in the conference room lit up at once. Northbridge Dynamics. Articles of incorporation. Founder and majority shareholder. Emma Carter. The silence became heavy. Daniel stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "This is some kind of misunderstanding." "It's not," I said evenly. Mark leaned forward. "What is this? A joke?" I pressed another command. The next slide appeared. Executive Conduct Review, Internal Audit Findings. Then another. Documented HR complaints. Expense report discrepancies. Email transcripts showing dismissive management patterns. Internal compliance flags. Kevin's face drained of color. Daniel's voice dropped. "You went through my emails?" "I reviewed executive oversight data," I corrected, "as is my legal responsibility." Tyler shook his head. "This is insane." "No," I replied calmly. "What's insane is believing your behavior would never be evaluated." Daniel's voice rose. "You set us up. I gave you authority," I said quietly. "You demonstrated how you handle it." He stepped closer to the table. "You let me believe you didn't even work." I never lied. "You hid it," I observed. His jaw tightened. For the first time in our marriage, Daniel looked unsure of his footing. "You embarrassed me," he said, almost accusing. I held his gaze. "You mocked me." The room went still. Security appeared discreetly in the hallway outside the glass walls. Not aggressive, just present. Mark cleared his throat. "Emma, whatever this is, we can talk privately." "There is nothing private about executive accountability," I replied. I opened my portfolio and slid 4 envelopes across the table, each labeled individually. Daniel Carter, Mark Reynolds, Tyler Brooks, Kevin Mitchell. Administrative leave. Effective. Immediately. Daniel didn't touch his envelope. You can't fire the VP of operations without board approval. The board is waiting, I said. Tyler whispered. You're serious. I am. Daniel looked at me like he was trying to recognize someone he had never truly seen. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. The question almost broke something in me, but I answered honestly. Because I wanted to know if you would respect me without knowing I was powerful. He looked away first. Mark opened his envelope with shaking hands. This says termination for cause pending review. Yes. Kevin's voice trembled. For jokes? For patterns, I said firmly. For leadership that undermines employees. For creating an environment where mockery is normalized. Daniel's voice hardened. This is personal. No, I replied. This is policy. I stood. Effective immediately, your executive access is suspended. Compliance will escort you to collect personal belongings. Daniel laughed once sharp and bitter. You're destroying your own marriage. I removed my wedding ring from my finger, placed it on the table in front of him. Our marriage required mutual respect, I said quietly. Not applause. He stared at the ring. Security stepped forward gently. Gentlemen, one of them said calmly. This way, please. Tyler walked first. Kevin followed, pale and silent. Mark didn't look at me again. Daniel was last. He paused at the doorway. You loved me, he said. I loved who I believed you were. I answered. He left. The door closed softly. The room felt enormous in the quiet. Sarah entered moments later. It's done, she said. I exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not triumph. Just gravity. Call the board in, I said. As I straightened the papers at the head of the table, I realized something important. Power doesn't shout. It signs. And for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't shrinking to protect someone else's ego. I was protecting what I built. And no one, not even my husband, was going to diminish it again. The board meeting began 10 minutes later. 12 directors. 2 compliance officers. Outside legal counsel present. No theatrics. Just structure. I stood at the head of the table, not as a wife, not as a wounded woman, but as CEO. Thank you for assembling on short notice, I began. Executive Review Protocol Level Red has been activated. The compliance officer projected the documentation onto the screen. Patterns of hostile leadership behavior. Repeated HR complaints suppressed at mid-level review. Vendor favoritism that bypassed policy checks. Intimidating performance evaluations lacking measurable metrics. No single incident was catastrophic, but leadership failure rarely is. It's cumulative. One director leaned forward. Are we exposed to litigation? Our bylaws include executive conduct clauses signed upon promotion, I replied. Termination for cause is legally defensible. Outside counsel nodded. Preliminary review confirms compliance grounds are sufficient. The vote was unanimous. Termination for cause effective immediately. Daniel's corporate credentials were deactivated within seconds. Email access revoked. Company phone disabled. Stock options frozen under misconduct clause review. Everything executed according to governance protocol. No public spectacle. Just accountability. That afternoon, Daniel called 17 times. I declined every call. At 4:12 p.m., he left a voicemail. Emma, this doesn't have to be nuclear. We can fix this. You're overreacting. Overreacting. The word no longer carried weight. By 5 p.m., legal filed divorce proceedings under the prenuptial agreement he once insisted we sign. The document was ironclad. Separate property. Executive misconduct protections. Asset shielding clauses. Daniel had believed it protected him from a hypothetical gold digger. It protected me from executive misconduct. Irony, again, is quiet. But the story didn't end with termination papers. The real work began the next morning. At 10 a.m. I addressed the entire company in the main auditorium. Hundreds of employees filled the seats. Some anxious, some confused, some hopeful. I didn't mention my marriage. I didn't mention dinner parties. I spoke only about leadership. Northbridge was founded on accountability, I said clearly. And accountability applies to everyone, including executives. The room was silent. We are implementing immediate reforms. Slides appeared behind me. Revised HR reporting chain bypassing executive interference. Independent Ethics Review Committee. Anonymous whistleblower protections with third-party oversight. Leadership training with measurable behavioral standards. This is not punishment, I continued. This is protection. For the first time, I saw employees exchange glances that weren't fearful. They were relieved. After the meeting, Sarah approached with her tablet. 2 former employees have already reached out, she said quietly. They're asking if they can reapply. I smiled faintly. Schedule interviews. With me. Daniel sent one final email that evening from a personal account. Subject: You didn't have to do this. The message was longer than his voicemail. Anger mixed with disbelief. You humiliated me. In front of my team. In front of the board. You could have handled this privately. I read it twice. Then I typed one sentence. Leadership accountability is never private. I didn't send anything else. By the end of the week, Northbridge stock rose modestly after investors received a transparent governance update. No scandal headlines. No tabloid drama. Just restructuring. Daniel's friends attempted to negotiate severance. Legal declined. Termination for cause voided executive bonuses. Their own contracts, which they signed confidently years ago, made that clear. When power feels permanent, people stop reading the fine print. I never did. Late Friday evening, I walked alone through the executive floor. The office felt different, quieter, lighter. I stepped into the conference room where everything changed. The head chair was empty. For years, Daniel had believed it was his. Now, it simply belonged to the role, and the role belonged to me, not because I exposed him, but because I built it. Accountability isn't revenge. It's maintenance. And sometimes, maintenance requires removing the part that's corroding the system, even when that part once shared your last name. I turned off the lights, locked the door. And for the first time in months, I slept without rehearsing a smaller version of myself. The first week after the termination felt strangely quiet, not chaotic, not explosive, just transitional. Daniel's absence echoed more in my personal life than in the office. At Northbridge, systems moved forward almost seamlessly. Departments reorganized, interim leadership stepped in, projects continued. At home, though, the silence had weight. His shoes were gone, his side of the closet was empty. The house no longer carried the sound of confident footsteps moving room to room. For a moment, I wondered if I had been too clinical, too composed. But leadership doesn't allow emotional shortcuts. It requires clarity even when clarity hurts. 3 days after the board vote, HR delivered a summary report. Over a dozen prior complaints tied indirectly to Daniel's executive group had resurfaced now that employees felt safe speaking up. Subtle intimidation, dismissive public comments, opportunities quietly reassigned after disagreements. Nothing headline-worthy, but enough to bruise careers. I sat in my office reviewing the files when Sarah knocked lightly. Jennifer Alvarez is here, she said. Former senior analyst. She resigned last year. I remembered her name. Brilliant strategist. Quiet confidence. Promoted late despite high-performance metrics. Send her in. Jennifer entered cautiously, hands clasped in front of her. I didn't expect to be invited back, she admitted. I didn't expect you to leave, I replied honestly. She hesitated before speaking. I loved this company, but after my proposal was dismissed in that quarterly meeting, I knew I wasn't being evaluated fairly. That meeting had been led by Daniel. He'd labeled her strategy overly optimistic. 6 months later, Northbridge adopted a nearly identical model proposed by someone else. I'm sorry that happened, I said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. Most CEOs don't apologize. I can't change the past, I continued, but I can change the structure that allowed it. We spoke for over an hour. By the time she left, she had accepted a newly created role, Director of Strategic Innovation, merit-based, transparent reporting lines, protected under revised oversight. When she shook my hand before leaving, her grip was steady. Thank you for seeing me, she said. I almost corrected her. I had always seen her. I just hadn't intervened soon enough. Outside the company, the narrative unfolded more slowly. Daniel moved into a temporary apartment downtown. Mutual friends began calling careful, probing. Is it true? Was it really that serious? Couldn't you two have worked it out privately? The answer was always the same. It wasn't about us. It was about leadership. Some understood. Some didn't. Daniel sent one more message, shorter this time. You didn't trust me. I stared at the words for a long time before typing back. Trust requires integrity. He didn't respond. 2 weeks later, Northbridge held its first open executive forum under the new governance model. Any employee could attend. No filtering. No pre-approved questions. I stood on stage with Sarah and the interim operations head. Ask anything, I said. At first, the room hesitated. Then, a junior developer raised his hand. Why didn't anyone step in sooner? It was a fair question. I didn't deflect. I underestimated how small behaviors compound. I answered. And that's on me. Another hand went up. Will executive performance reviews be transparent now? Yes, I said. Starting this quarter. The tone of the room shifted. Not fear. Engagement. Participation. Ownership. By the end of the session, applause wasn't dramatic, but it was real. That evening, I walked through the main workspace as employees packed up for the day. Laughter drifted through cubicles. Teams discussed ideas freely. No one lowered their voice when an executive passed. The culture felt breathable. Sarah joined me near the window overlooking the city. Stock closed up 8% today, she said. Investors appreciate stability. Stability built on accountability, I corrected gently. She smiled. You're not angry anymore. I considered that. Anger had fueled the initial shift. But rebuilding required something steadier. No, I said finally. I'm not angry. I was resolved. Because the truth is this. Firing Daniel wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was accepting that the man I loved had chosen ego over partnership. And accepting that protecting my company meant letting go of him. But leadership isn't about comfort. It's about alignment between values and action. Northbridge was stronger. Employees were safer. Systems were fairer. That mattered. Late that night, alone in the executive conference room, I looked at the chair Daniel once occupied. I didn't feel triumph. I felt perspective. Power doesn't corrupt automatically. It reveals. And once revealed, you either correct it or you become complicit. I had chosen correction. And for the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own life. Not hidden. Not minimized. Just Emma, CEO, builder, woman who finally stopped shrinking. And that was enough. 6 months have a way of softening the sharpest edges. When I stand in my office now, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Chicago skyline, I don't feel the storm that once moved through these walls. I feel momentum. Northbridge just closed its strongest quarter in company history. Revenue is up 18%. Employee retention has increased. HR reports 0 unresolved complaints. But numbers were never the true victory. Culture was. Jennifer's division launched 2 new client initiatives that outperformed projections by double digits. Young analysts now speak confidently in meetings without being cut off. Managers are evaluated not just on output but on leadership behavior. Accountability is measurable now. Transparency is expected. Respect is standard. And it didn't happen because I fired my husband. It happened because I decided leadership wasn't negotiable. Daniel and I finalized our divorce 3 months ago. No public spectacle. No courtroom drama. Just signatures. He tried once more to meet for coffee. I never meant to disrespect you, he said quietly, staring at his untouched cup. I believe that, I replied. And you still did. He didn't argue. That was the first time I saw real reflection in his eyes. Not anger, not pride, just understanding. I underestimated you, he admitted. I almost smiled. You underestimated partnership, I corrected gently. We left that conversation without bitterness. Closure doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. Friends still ask how I kept my identity hidden for so long. The truth is simple. I wanted to be loved without my title attached. I wanted to know if someone would value my thoughts, even if they believed I had no influence. But here's what I've learned. Diminishing yourself doesn't create equality. It creates imbalance. Daniel didn't fall out of love with me. He fell in love with a version of me that was smaller. And when that version disappeared, he didn't know how to stand beside the real one. Last week, I stood on the auditorium stage again, this time announcing Northbridge's mentorship initiative for women entering executive leadership. The applause felt different, not because I had won, but because we had grown. After the event, a young intern approached me. I almost didn't apply here, she confessed. I heard things used to be intimidating. They were, I said honestly. And now? Now we're building something better. She nodded, hopeful. That hope matters more than any board vote ever did. At home, the house feels different. Not emptier, just quieter. Peace doesn't echo the way tension does. Some evenings I sit by the window with a glass of wine, the same place Daniel once laughed about my lack of ambition, and I think about what truly changed. Not my power, not my success, just my willingness to stop hiding it, because silence can be strategic, but silence should never be permanent. The greatest lesson wasn't that I could fire my husband. It was that leadership requires courage long before confrontation. It requires setting boundaries before resentment grows. It requires choosing integrity over comfort. If someone ever mocks your worth because they can't see your value, remember this. Not everyone who doubts you deserves a seat at your table. And if they're sitting at a table you built, you have every right to stand up, reclaim your place, and lead with dignity. 6 months ago, I stopped shrinking. Today, I don't need to prove anything. I simply lead. And that, finally, feels like freedom.